Data from Statistics South Africa shows that total employment in the formal sector declined by 133,000 or by 1.2% in the third quarter. That's compared to the second quarter. The quarterly employment statistics is a survey of the formal economy. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Ntombi-Mbele Thomo. She's an independent economist. Thank you so much, Ntombi, for joining us. So, of course, not a great thing to see that there's been a decrease in the formal employment levels, but again, not much of a surprise. What's your overall reading of the data?
Thank you so much for having me and good afternoon. I think the overall reading of the data is positive. And I think as a country, we need to start speaking about, these kinds of data outputs that when they do come out, we reflect on exactly what they mean and their significance. So I think it's good to see that the overall unemployment for the first time this whole year is seeing a downward trajectory, and since we had experienced it in 2023 in the third quarter as well. So that's one, highly appreciated. But also two, when you look at the discouraged job seekers, the employment ratio for them as well has also decreased to 41.9%. So that's also really welcome, because what it's saying is that people who ordinarily would have given up on looking for employment are starting again to be, interested in going into the market and trying to find a place of work.
Well, that is very positive indeed. But what were your observations around the actual trends around full-time work as opposed to part-time work?
So the observations with the trend around the full-time employment is that you've also been seeing that even within the regulatory space, there has been a much more of a stronger shift towards the more part-time employment, as most companies are also trying to relieve themselves with some of the packaging and the cost implication that comes with having to employ a person on the more full-time basis. And so that has been the general market movement. And we've also seen that being continued even in the third quarter. I do think it's a cause for concern. I think in terms of providing sustainable employment, which is a big issue in the country. So I do think that is something that the Labour Regulatory Department, particularly that of the state, needs to look at with much more vigor and be able to engage with the private sector to find ways that will be more beneficial for the private sector to employ people on a permanent basis and also provide them with the necessary benefits.
Yeah. Now, when you look at the various sectors in terms of where we saw declines, which sectors are you particularly worried about? For example, manufacturing.
Manufacturing is a huge cause of concern. As you know, Nompu, manufacturing has the highest, ability to absorb unskilled laborers. Manufacturing has the most propensity to economic growth in the country. And so that on its own, this negative decline shows that it's a cause for concern. I do think, though, that currently we need to, one, look at how to ensure that manufacturing does not find itself having to lose employment or lose workers. And I think the biggest issue there would be how do we best as a state provide support into the manufacturing inputs? How do we ensure that manufacturing goods and outputs are able to reach the end user? So it's much more of a cyclical and, I would even say that the main issue is the fact that goods are not able to reach consumers on time, even in the export market. And the trickle-down effect ends up with companies having to reduce workers on a permanent basis. And we're therefore, met with this kind of result where people in the manufacturing sector are not really able to keep their jobs.
Yeah.
But on a more lighter note, Nompu, you do see construction picking up again. And I think that is something that, again, we must, commend, because also like the manufacturing sector, the construction industry is able to absorb a lot of our unskilled laborers. And that is really what, even though it's also very cyclical, it's something that we really need to be able to channel our energies as a state to be able to absorb the readily available labor force that is not really put into productive use.
Yeah, you talk about construction also being cyclical, but hopefully that cycle of positivity is going to last for a long time, since our president keeps on talking about making the country a construction site.
I think that's true. And I think Nompu, with these kind of relations where we see him now hosting the president of Angola and also, really forming stronger ties in a bilateral sense with African countries, but also the opportunity that is presented by the G20 presidencies, that you have businesses that are now able to be much more, privy to the South African market, but also be able to engage with other businesses that are already existing in the South African market. And there you have the opportunity of creating business-to-business linkages. And those are going to be the ones that are going to fast-track growth, and growth that is centered around creating a constructive hub where foreign direct investment that is more sustainable is able to be created in the country. So I do think that the kind of initiatives that the state has been engaging in, again, the Angola, presidential bilateral engagement, the B2B and the businesses engagements, as well as the G20, present us with an opportunity where we can actually concretize the construction contribution to the South African economy in a much more sustained manner.
Yeah, you touch on that Angolan state visit. Of course, we were just watching the presidents of Angola and South Africa giving their introductory speeches for this visit. We're currently on visuals at the Union buildings where a press briefing by both gentlemen is going to be given. But, how important is Angola? I mean, one always thinks about it as being an oil nation with a lot of potential, but we know that commodities have tended to be a curse for African countries because they've not been able to get out of that cycle and diversify. How important is the Angolan economy for us to work with South Africa?
Nompu, I think you touch on it. Because of their natural endowment of oil and crude petroleum, I think they also just that on its own creates a very important relationship that South Africa needs to establish, or even, form stronger ties with Angola. I think in 2023, we've also seen that the Angolan trade with South Africa, I think, was to the amount of 13.5 billion, if I'm correct. And that already is a significant amount of money when you look at the bilateral trade facilitation between the two countries, firstly. But also you look at Angola in terms of its, approaching the African Union presidency in 2025. That on its own is going to be very crucial, with South Africa being one in the G20 presidency, but also two, being able to forge forward the African agenda on the geopolitical and the global continent. So I think that is quite crucial, because it's not only looking at the bilateral engagements, but looking at the strategic positioning that Angola has currently on the continent, being able to influence policy, being able to be an intermediary in terms of peace relations. As Angolan president just recently mentioned, that what's been happening in the region is a cause for concern, and how they've been an active country and leader in the region in being able to provide some form of peace and mediation. So I think from a trade relations, there's definitely a benefit, but also from a position of leadership and influence on the continent, this, I think, was a worthwhile exercise by the South African presidency and government to host the Angolan delegation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ntombi. More to talk about, but not enough time, but we'll leave it there. Ntombi-Mbele Thomo, she's an independent economist.